thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's a great honour to speak to you today. As Peter has said, my experiences, but the first 15 years of my career, I was a surgeon, spent most of that time working in the East End of Glasgow, where it was the poorest parliamentary constituency in Britain, and the gap in life expectancy between people that I was dealing with and those that lived a few miles away was as much as 15 years. And patients used to come in and ask me, you know, with conditions, recurrent conditions like acute pancreatitis, alcohol-induced and so on, or bleeding peptic ulcer, and I'd say to them, you've got to stop the booze. You've got to stop drinking, otherwise you'll die. And the response was inevitably, so what? What have I got to live for? The booze is one of the only pleasures I have. And that's what led me to think that the problem was not enough wellness, not too much illness. And after 5 or 6 years as a consultant, I gave up surgery, went off and did a master's in public health. And ever since then, my career has been to unravel the science behind wellness. Because my argument, one of my friends, a neurosurgeon, went off and became a politician and became Scottish Health Minister, and he once said, you should become a politician. I said, I'd rather have my fingernails pulled out one by one, to be honest. And my argument has always been, if you've got the science behind you, it's easier to persuade politicians. At least it's easier to persuade them in Scotland because they actually listen to science. Sorry, I wasn't having a go at Australian politicians, for goodness sake. So, this is the World Health Organization definition of health, as you know, complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. And in fact, all our training on understanding the pathology of illness and understanding the treatment and so on is about the second half of that. The way in which we create a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being is not really something we hear much about at medical school. And a few years ago, the British Medical Journal sponsored a group to come up with a better definition of health, and it included this notion that to be healthy, you need to have the capacity to adapt to the external circumstances that you found yourself in, and to be able to self-manage in the light of adversity. And this seemed to me to be perfectly rational, in as much as what I was seeing in my patients was an inability to adapt to adversity. And the more I began to unravel it, the more I found that there was indeed a consistent science behind it. But the first thing we had to do was we had to really understand what the basis of health inequalities. This is what the newspapers tell us about health in Scotland. We're a basket case, we're the least healthy people on the planet, because we smoke too much, we eat the wrong kind of food, we drink too much, and if only we would man up and do the right thing, everything would be well. In fact, when you look at it, only one of those statements is true, and for those of you going to the gala dinner tonight, I'm afraid it's the one about the booze, okay? So, we're not basically unhealthy as a nation. This is life expectancy trends in 16 Western European countries going back to 1851, 160 years worth of data. You can see that for most of that time, Scotland has been in the middle of the European pack. It's only in the past few decades that we've drifted to the back, and that line is the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population. Affluent Scots have done rather well over the past 40 or 50 years. Poor Scots, on the other hand, that's the rate of growth in life expectancy in them. Scotland's poor health is a reflection of the health of the poor. If you're well off and you've got a job in Scotland, you do pretty well in health terms. The dietary bit of this has been very misleading. One of the biggest projects that sought to influence death rates from heart disease by altering diet is the North Karelia project in Finland. And you can see in that graph, the yellow line is heart disease mortality in men under the age of 75 in Finland. And you can see back in the 1960s, they had a very high heart disease mortality. So they decided to change the diet. And I once asked the director of the Finnish Institute of Public Health how they changed the Finnish diet. And what he said to me, and I'm quoting him verbatim, is, he said, well, the Finnish Institute of Public Health told the Finnish government what to do, the Finnish government told the Finnish people what to do, and the Finnish people did it. So I said, well, that's Scotland screwed because we never do anything we're told. They took subsidies away from dairy farmers to discourage them from producing milk, butter, cream, cheese, etc., thereby making the Finns the most miserable people in Europe. And they gave them the subsidies back if they'd switched to growing fruit and vegetables. And they made free fruit and free salads compulsory in all schools and workplaces. And they created a huge medical tourism industry because doctors flocked from all over the world to see the Finnish miracle. You can see the heart disease rate fell. But alongside that yellow line is this pale green line, which is the Scottish heart disease mortality. Scots took radical action to change their diet. The Finns took radical action to change their diet. Scots did absolutely hee-haw to change their diet. Now that's wrong. The Scots invented the deep-fried Mars bar during this time. And we got the same result. The problem, or the change came about because men in the 1960s, since the 1960s, men have given up smoking in huge numbers, and introduction of drugs like statins and so on. Every Western country has seen the same fall. But yet we've been brainwashed into thinking all of this. Do you know who invented the 5-a-day slogan? Fruit Growers of America Association. Bit of a conflict of interest there, I would have said. Smoking, I won't show you the slides because we're short of time, but Scottish smoking rates are actually lower than the Western European average. A study done by the World Health Organization showed that Scottish teenagers were the 5th lowest smokers out of about 40 European countries. And Scottish men in another study, 3rd lowest smokers, beaten only by the Finns and the Swedes. So it wasn't smoking. So what was it? Now, a colleague of mine called Alistair Leyland began to look at inequality in health in a completely different way. He began to split the population into 5-year age bands and looked at mortality rates across the socioeconomic divide. So this is death rate per 100,000 population in the most affluent quintile of the population, all the way down to the poorest quintile. And if you subtract the best from the worst and divide by the mean, you come up with a single number, which he called the slope index of inequality. So a 45-degree slope is roughly 1. He then plotted that slope index of inequality across the life course, and that's what it looks like for Scots. This is men, but women are roughly the same. You can see that inequality in mortality is not a feature particularly of the elderly. It rises spectacularly in teenage years, is at its highest in the 20s and 30s and starts to come down after the 40s. Those aren't the people who are dying of heart disease and cancer. So all this stuff about, you know, we need to stop people smoking, we need to do this, that, and the next thing, actually it's not the main problem. Yes, we should do it, but there's something else going on in the population. So Alistair started to plot a slope index of inequality for specific causes of ill health, for example, ischemic heart disease here. And when you plot that, that's how heart disease contributes to inequality in the Scottish population. Hardly at all. So what's going on in the big bulge? It's causes of death in young people from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence. We're not going to fix that by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. It's psychosocially determined, and we need to work out what are the drivers of all of this. Now, a word about the booze, because the story there is interesting and illuminating. This slide shows mortality rates in our 16 Western European countries from liver cirrhosis, going back to 1850. The line at the top is the highest level anyone reached since 1950. This bit of it is France. In the 50s and 60s, French had the highest mortality. The lowest mortality any country reached is here, and that's the European mean. And from 1950 to 1970, that was the Scottish alcoholic liver disease mortality. This notion of Scots as happy drunks is a myth, okay? Because apart from anything else, we're never happy about anything. From 1970 to 1990, that's what happened. It went up a bit, but was still below the European average. And then from 1990, that's what happened for both men and women. Culture around alcohol shifted, and you got spectacular rises. So what we're postulating is that some societal change happened 2, 3, 4, 5 decades ago that began to see turbulence in society that had reflected onto people who were born round about the 1960s, 1970s perhaps. And when you begin to see what happened, in the 1950s, West Central Scotland particularly had full employment, which gave men meaning and purpose in life. In 1900, 2/3 of all merchant shipping launched anywhere in the world were launched on the River Clyde. And that shipbuilding industry was maintained throughout the first half of the 20th century. Other counties had steelmaking, had traditional heavy industries, which began to disappear in the 60s and 70s. And at the same time, there was a housing revolution taking place. The old traditional tenement-based housing, this is a picture of a part of Glasgow known as the Gorbals in the mid-19th century. What you see there is a community. Children out playing, adults out socializing, keeping an eye on the children and so on. But by the 1950s and 1960s, smart people thought they needed to make the housing more livable, and we got this kind of thing. Filing cabinets for people. So traditional communities were being broken by loss of employment and loss of that sense of community. People would be spread across the west of Scotland, and the friends that they'd had for a lifetime they'd never see again. No mobile phones to keep in touch with them. So social chaos supervened, and is it the case that that has eroded the capacity for wellness and led to the problems we're seeing? So I began to look for this notion of wellness, and I came across this term salutogenesis as opposed to pathogenesis. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being and safety, and colleagues in the Nordic School of Public Health have produced this slide. There are 25 different concepts under that salutogenic umbrella. And of course, I'll take you through all 25 of them one by one. Actually, when you read them, and I've read just about all of them, Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theory, I can't bring myself to read yet, but the rest of them have common themes. Young people who grow up with an optimistic and positive outlook tend to do well in the well-being stakes. If you have a sense that you're in control of your life, and you want to be in control because you've got a sense of purpose and meaning in life, then you're likely to do well. And that's what was happening with my alcoholic men. They had no sense of purpose. They had no sense of being in control. If you are confident in your ability to deal with problems and you have supportive people round about you, all of these theories have these themes running through them. The one that made me sit up and take note, however, was this one. Aaron Antonovsky was an American sociologist who studied the health of adults who as children had been in concentration camps. 70% of them had real problems, 30% survived. And he came up with this concept of developing a sense of coherence, the sense that the world is structured, predictable, explainable, the sense that we have the internal resources to meet the challenges that the world throws at us, and finally, that we see those challenges as worthy of engaging with. And Antonovsky said that unless you see the world as comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful, you would experience a state of chronic stress. Now, I remember reading that passage in his book, and I sat bolt upright. I thought, yes, this is the link between the social circumstances and the ill health, because I was a surgeon. And a surgeon's job, as you all know, is to create acute stress in people. That's precisely what a surgical operation is. It's an acute stressor which activates a whole range of bodily responses involved with responding to threat and healing. And I thought, well, what would the impact of this chronic stress be? But first of all, I had to establish that he was right. And there's literally thousands of studies in the literature that show that social circumstances are associated with chronic elevation of the stress response. This is one that shows how early it starts. Canadian data looking at cortisol levels in children who are in care. There is something chronically stressing to a child in not having a single significant adult to relate to. And that gets carried on into adulthood. The notion of not having a positive view of the future is also interesting. This study was carried out by an American lady called Susan Everson, who went to Finland to study these men at high risk of heart disease. She measured every single thing you could think of, like their cholesterol, their blood pressure, their educational attainment, and she had a hopelessness score, which she used to divide these men into 3 groups. Those that were very, very hopeless, those that were moderately hopeless, and those that were just a little bit hopeless, because she was a woman, and she knew that all men are hopeless to a greater or lesser extent. She adjusted her results to take account of all the other factors, and hopelessness was an independent predictor of outcome, an independent predictor of risk of death from heart disease, cancer, and other causes. So again, another link that this absence of being able to create a positive outlook for yourself was associated with physical ill health. So what was the link? What was happening here? And I began to put the pieces together when I encountered an experiment carried out in the psychology department of a New York university, and the experiment was to make baby monkeys depressed. That's not a happy baby monkey, okay? So how did they do this? One half of the animal house, mum was allowed to feed the baby at will. She was playing with the baby, the food was there. When baby indicated he was hungry, went down, baby fed. The other half of the animal house, they took the food away and they hid it. So mum had to leave the baby for a long time, go and forage for the food, had to fight with other mums to get the food. So she was stressed and she was absent for a lot of the time. And if I were to ask you which group of babies would be stressed, you would naturally think it would be the second group, where mum was away and stressed by the experience, wouldn't you? Yeah. When I ask that question, I can always tell who the working mums are in the room, because they're shifting uneasily in their seats. In fact, ladies, you needn't worry, because it made no difference. These are the stress hormone levels where mum found it easy to feed them. Those are the stress hormone levels where mum found it hard to feed them, and they're the same. But these are the stress hormone levels where they randomly change the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It's not mum being there or mum not being there, it's baby not knowing. And if you go back to Antonovsky's structured, predictable, manageable, just think about it. What's the first stressor a baby feels when he's born? Is hunger. So what does he do? He cries. And what does mum do? She picks him up, talks to him, feeds him, stress resolved. Contrast, and by the time that happens 500, 1,000 times, baby learns that all he has to do is the crying thing. This mug comes along and fixes it. So the world is structured, predictable, and he's in control. Contrast that to the experience of a baby who, when he cries, sometimes gets fed, but sometimes doesn't, because mum's drunk or under the influence of drugs. And even worse, the boyfriend picks the crying baby up and shakes him and slaps him. Baby learns the world is not structured, it's not predictable, it's occasionally painful, and he has no control over what happens. So this begins to point to chronic elevation of the stress response. And Bruce McEwen, whose slide this is, professor of neurobiology at Rockefeller University in New York, has shown that that kind of stressful early life is associated with differential brain growth. Babies who experience chaotic early years see reductions in cell density in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and increased activity in the amygdala. The significance of that is great because the amygdala is associated with emotional arousal. So these babies are more anxious, aggressive, fearful, because they have to be alert because they don't know where the next bit of danger is coming from. The prefrontal cortex is a bit of the brain that integrates new knowledge and allows you to respond appropriately. So these children are less well able to respond appropriately to stressful situations. So link that up with the fact that they're more aggressive and they're less able to manage that aggression leads to problems. And the other thing is the hippocampus is associated with memory, and it does not form in such size in stressed young people, and therefore they do less well at school. They don't learn so well at school. We didn't just take the laboratory stuff as granted. We went out into the streets of Glasgow and got people and scanned their brains. I was a bit worried about going down the East End and asking people, can I scan your brain, mate? But I needn't have worried because they were desperate to have their brains scanned. You mean you're going to prove I've got a brain? Because these were young men that were told persistently at school they were stupid. And one of them asked me, could I give him a certificate to prove it? But we were able to do things like measure hippocampal volume with serial sections, measure cell density and so on. And what Bruce McEwen was showing in the lab and what several other researchers have shown is exactly the case in affluent and deprived people. We went further and did the psychometrics testing to prove that the function was impaired. And I'll just show you one study. Choice reaction time is a measure of prefrontal cortex activity, processing new information. What this shows is that most deprived Scots take about 200 milliseconds longer to respond to new information that appears on a computer screen and hit the correct button. And if 200 milliseconds doesn't strike you as being very much, imagine two cars being driven side by side at 50 miles an hour, one by a rich guy, one guy, a poor guy, and a child walks out in front of them. The car being driven by the guy who's had the chaotic early years will take about 2 car lengths longer to stop. He's the one most likely to knock down the child. So poor people are being handicapped in all sorts of ways that we don't really appreciate. This is the molecular biology of a cuddle, okay? This is what happens when you cuddle a baby. It's probably what happens when you cuddle me, but that depends on who's doing the cuddling. But this is the link. This is the mechanism by which the chronic upregulation of the stress response occurs, and it's an epigenetic mechanism. This is Michael Meany's work from McGill University in Montreal, and he looked at the brains of young people who had died violent deaths and found that the hippocampus, which is the bit of the brain that has the densest concentration of cortisol receptors, had significantly lower cortisol receptors if they had a history of abuse or neglect. And the mechanism by which the hippocampus gets those cortisol receptors is through comforting. When a baby is comforted and feels safe, 5-HT, serotonin, is released by the neurons into the bloodstream, picked up by a transport mechanism on the cell wall. Chromosome number 5 has a glucocorticoid receptor gene on it, which is activated when it comes into contact with 5-HT. Neglected babies don't get enough 5-HT, they don't get enough happiness to activate the mechanism they need to suppress the stress response. So we've got a biological mechanism that links chaotic circumstances, particularly in early life, to chronic upregulation of stress responses, differential patterns of brain activity that lead to failure at school, increased risk of offending behavior, etc., etc. It begins to make some pattern of sense. And when you look at large population studies, the Adverse Childhood Events study in California, the ACEs study in members of the Kaiser Permanente health system, looked at 9 different types of adverse event in a child's life. and they related them to subsequent outcome. Children who experience 4 or more of those adverse events are 8 times more likely to become alcoholics, 11 times more likely to be narcotics abusers. Boys who experience physical violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence when they grow up, 4 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. By the age of 32, almost half of the participants in this study with 4 or more adverse events had been arrested for a non-traffic offence. The Dunedin cohort in the South Island of New Zealand, in the 1970s, we had 1,000 children identified for follow-up. Subgroup of those living in chaotic circumstances have been followed up into their 40s. They are now more likely to be unemployed, more likely to have criminal convictions for violence, experience teenage pregnancy, be substance misusers, and to have metabolic syndrome, chronic elevation of their stress responses. The economic cost of 1 year's worth of child neglect in the ACEs study has been calculated at $124 billion to the US economy, in terms of increased costs of care and the fact that these people will never contribute to the economy. It's spectacular. That's the pattern of morbidity in terms of increased risk of heart disease and cancer, which is slightly increased, but significant increases in odds ratio of developing a drug addiction, alcohol addiction, suicide, and so on. This is the pattern of morbidity we've seen in studies in Glasgow, comparing Glasgow outcomes with the outcomes of other cities in the United Kingdom that haven't had this social turbulence. So what we're postulating is there's a cycle here that alienates people and impairs their ability to control their well-being. And it starts with chaotic early years. These children have bad behavior, mental health problems are diagnosed. When they go to school, they're more likely to be excluded from school, fail in education, end up in jail because they punch somebody or, wander about with a knife and so on, get arrested, and have spend a lot of time in prison, and most of the time they let me out. And you talk to 18-year-olds who are in jail, and you ask them, what are you going to do when you get out? And they say, I'll never get a job because I've got a criminal record. So what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink, because they lose any sense of control, any sense of wanting to engage with the world. What they don't count on is the fact that the girlfriend will have a couple of babies, and the cycle will go on into the next generation. So our approach to improving wellness is to break that cycle by doing things in early life. And just to last couple of minutes to talk about our approach to policy change and implementation of change in Scotland. And this is the way it's been conventionally done. You get a group of experts into a conference room in the Ministry of Health, and these experts talk for a bit, and a civil servant writes it all down, and they come back a couple of months later and they do more talking, etc., and that cycle goes on for several months. Then a report goes to the minister, who says, yeah, okay, and a civil servant writes an implementation plan, and it goes out into the real world, and nothing happens, okay? And nothing happens for that reason, because people at the front line haven't been involved in shaping the plan. So when we decided to change things in Scotland, we decided to keep ministers well away from it. We'd got frontline staff together to say, what do you think is needed? And they came up with ideas, and they went out and tested them. And they came back 6 months later and told us the results of the tests. And they went out and tested some more things, and they shared ideas across Scotland. I don't know if there are any cyclists here. I don't want to cause you pain, but Australia used to have the best track cycling team in the world. But this notion of marginal gains we stole from the British cycling team. Go out there, try lots of things, see what works, and then do it all consistently. Oh, and by the way, we'll tell the minister sometime, because we all know politicians like to take credit for success, other people's ideas. For example, we started off with a patient safety program. We set out to do this. We got people to test things to reduce infection, to prevent cardiac arrest, and so on. And that led to almost a 16% reduction in standardised mortality rates in Scottish hospitals over a few years. We then applied this to child health, and the first thing we saw changing was a reduction in stillbirth, and we said, let's see a reduction in stillbirth rate by 15% by 2015. We saw an 18% reduction in stillbirth rate. We've seen a 15% reduction in infant mortality so far. We're moving on into looking at developmental progress in 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds and so on. And it's the frontline staff that are designing this. For example, one nursery came up with the idea, well, attachment is improved if parents read bedtime stories to kids. So let's ask the kids, did you get a bedtime story last night? And they started plotting it, and they started doing things to see how they would get the rate of bedtime stories going up, and then they would share these ideas with other nurseries. And over the past few years, we've seen 1,500 small tests of change being carried out in child health. And maybe about 60 or 70 of them have gone into common production. And to begin with, ministers were desperate to come and do the 20-minute ministerial speech. And one time our finance minister came and he asked me, if I put money into early years, will it ultimately save the country money? And I thought, right, I'll just test how serious he is here. So I said to him, yes, you will, but it might take 40 years. But by then you will have closed prisons. And his response was, that's exactly the right thing to do. Not many politicians are prepared to accept that kind of time horizon. But in fact, we've delivered change much earlier. And actually that day, he came for the 20-minute speech. He stayed for 5 hours. And when he left, he said, this is the most amazing piece of public sector reform I have ever seen. So I just want to finish. One of the things you get when you're chief medical officer is lots of folk come and make you honorary fellows of organisations. I'm an honorary fellow of the Royal Incorporation of Architects of Scotland because I talk a lot about place in health. And I asked the secretary, what does that mean I can do now? And he said, well, it means you can draw pictures of houses and charge an exorbitant fee for them. So if anyone's interested in the original, let me know. But the way we conceptualise health is the health service is the guy at the top of the waterfall who sees people drowning in the river, and the health service pulls the drowning person out the river. And the public health service says, why are these people in the river? And he goes upstream to find a hole in the fence and stops them falling in the river. That's exactly the wrong paradigm, okay? We're all in the river all the time. And one side of the river is in the sunshine, and you float along and there's a guy handing out mojitos and beers, and it's very pleasant. The other side of the river is where the crocodiles and the sharks and the rocks are. And from time to time in our life, we'll drift over to that side. The challenge for us interested in well-being is to teach people to navigate the river, to understand when they're getting into danger, and to show them the way back in and to support them in that process. So that's what we've set about doing in Scotland. We've asked folk to be brave and courageous in attempting things, but whatever they do, they must remember the hugs. Thanks very much. That's good.
Thanks very much. That was truly wonderful. We've got time for a few questions from the audience. I think we've got a question on this side.
Good morning. My name's Kristine Dixon. Thank you. I just came towards the end of that presentation, but I come from a very different space than health. I come from the police. And so very much that you've talked about is wonderfully encouraging. And I suppose I remember talking to paediatricians back in 1978 who said they could predict the kids that would be in trouble. And what I guess my pessimism in some ways is we've known that a long time.
Yeah.
And your research about kids and kids in out-of-home care, all of the kind of uncertainty in their lives. I guess the question is, how do we get the various players to come together to see what seems so obvious to you and to many people here? So I guess that's my question.
Did you say you came from the police?
I do.
Yeah, right. Well, the police are fantastic with us in Scotland. What we're doing is we're creating an alliance of every single public sector agency. And when I went to see the Police Scotland, I got about 3 sentences out my mouth when they said, you can have all our data. We'll tell you who phones us. We'll tell you our incident reports and so on. And, no concern about confidentiality, because this is about identifying kids who need help. So, what I'm finding is this resonates across the whole of the public sector, and police are really involved. And so I give CPD lectures to senior policemen. I give lectures to judges, although judges are a bit dodgy.
They are.
When I gave a series of lectures to judges in Scotland and got the feedback, half of them said, this is really interesting stuff and it will affect my sentencing policy. The other half said, this is of no interest to me whatsoever, I just apply the law. Okay? But gradually we're winning, and the police are being terrific allies, as are the fire and rescue services.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Hindmarsh. I'm a GP in Sydney. I have a special interest in family abuse and violence. So thank you very much that was a fantastic talk. But what I want to know is, what are you doing about protecting kids from that sort of pre and moment of birth when they come into abusive families?
So what you want to know is from the moment of birth, is that what you're saying? How are we going to manage them? Well, one of the things that we've got in Scotland, we've had it now for about 50 years, is we have a very integrated data set. I mean, if I go to a local authority, I can ask them, and I have done this, and the process is as quick as I describe it. I can say to them, show me all the families where the father's in jail. Show me which of the mothers in these families is on antidepressants. Show me what the school attendance record of the children is. Show me what the health records of those children are, and you begin to get a picture of what's happening in families. And the aim is to use this data set to identify probably chaotic families, and then to begin to support those families at the early possible moment. We want, in fact, to go before birth and during pregnancy, and particularly things like alcohol consumption during pregnancy. But at this stage, I can't tell you what we're going to do, because that's something the frontline staff have to shape. I can't come along and tell them what to do. They have to get together and start testing interventions themselves. But all of this stuff is on our radar.
Question over here?
No. Sorry.
Not sure that's on. Yes, it is now. Kirsty Douglas. One of the reasons I wanted to ask this question was I just want Scott to say my name properly. But it was a fantastic talk, and thank you very much. Do you have any suggestions for us in Australia with getting our politicians to listen to science? And how do we start to get the message through? Because at the moment, it's not.
Every time I come to Australia, I read the newspapers assiduously to try and figure out Australian politics, okay? And I see the papers today, it's just all gone up in the air again, apparently. I am very fortunate. For 5 years when I was Chief Medical Officer, Nicola Sturgeon was our Health Minister, and she's now our First Minister. She is the smartest politician I have ever met. So we've got that relationship. She describes my style of management as proceed until apprehended. I take that as a really big compliment, okay? You just do it. Politicians love to take credit for successes. Don't ask for permission. It's much better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, okay? So what I would suggest is just start doing some of this stuff and begin to scale it up. I've spent the past couple of days with health people in Sydney who are talking about this. And I think the soil is ripe to do things in this city, certainly. Jerry Marr, who's the Chief Executive of the South East Sydney Health Authority, Jerry was one of our great supporters when he was the Chief of Tayside Health in Scotland. So go to them and say, right, we're up for this. Just do it. Don't ask for permission. And you can do it without huge resources because the staff are already there. You just have to persuade them to do what they know needs to be done rather than worry about the rules and regulations. Because the rules and regulations are there to protect the organisation, not to protect the people.
One more question.
Thank you very much.
Catch me at coffee.
Amongst the myriad factors that you've researched and looked into and know about, is a universal basic income one of the factors?
That is one of my things at the moment. I've been collecting a lot of data on that, and there is profound evidence that it affects things. One of the most... Richard Nixon, would you believe, was the president who was on the verge of signing this into law in the States. And the evidence, things like cities with universal basic income saw a 30% increase in high school graduation rates. Other places saw significant reductions in low birth weight babies and so on. But just before he signed it, one city reported a 50% increase in divorce rate. And this, of course, meant that if you made women financially independent, they would walk away from their husbands. And that didn't appeal to the right-wing American voter. So they dropped it. And then some years later, someone found all the data and found it was completely fabricated. It was fake news, even. So the evidence that universal basic income damages things just isn't there. So we're talking with the First Minister about that. She, in a recent programme for government, announced that they were going to investigate universal basic income in Scotland. It will probably mean us keeping our own oil, but that'll do. I can cope with that. Okay.
Harry, thanks very much. Thanks very much for coming to Australia, for sharing your knowledge and your humour. And we wish you a safe journey back home.
Thank you very much. Thank you.